Hello and welcome. This is NetLab 02, installing and configuring an ESXi host. I'm Richard Golson and I'm here to introduce you to the lab. So let's have a look. Right now you can see that I am currently logged into a NetLab pod. You can see the pod name here. Here's the reservation. So I had made this reservation previously, logged on now, and here we go. You can see I'm in lab 2, and this is the topology that we'll be following, and you will also find that I've already logged into the SA student, and we're going to take a look at a few other things here briefly while we go through this introduction. So let's take a look at what this lab's all about. Here we can see that there are 5 tasks that we'll be performing during this lab. And here's our introduction, including the objectives, which is to install ESXi, to configure ESXi, to enable the ESXi shell and secure shell, to add an ESXi host to the Active Directory, and log into the ESXi host as an Active Directory user. Now I wanted to explain to you about what ESXi is first before we get started. It's a specialized operating system. It's designed and tuned to run your virtual machines. Now this OS, this ESXi hypervisor, runs directly on the host. So this is a type 1 hypervisor. Install it directly in the host instead of a regular standard operating system like Linux or Windows or Macs. And it has a small disk footprint. This which will allow it to free up more of the resources, the CPU, memory storage network, for use by your virtual machines that it hosts. Now the ESXi hypervisor is installable both on internal and external storage devices, including hard disks, SSDs, SAN LUNs, USB devices, SD cards, SATA-DOM, and diskless hosts. ESXi has several different features that provide security and reliability. Let's start with the host-based firewall, which can be managed by both the vSphere client and the VMware host client to control both your incoming and outgoing connections for a service or management agent. Let's take a look at that for a moment here. Here we can see that the firewall for the ESXi 2 host is accessible in the vSphere client, and I've selected it under Configure, and if you look down here, System Firewall. And if you look in here, you can see that here's where we are able to edit and modify settings for ports, services, etc., to allow both incoming or to block incoming, outgoing connections. And so you can see here the 2 different areas. So this is our firewall. We won't be working with this in the lab, but I did want you to see this. Other features included with the ESXi OS or hypervisor includes the lockdown mode, which is a vSphere feature, and that will disable login and API functions from being executed directly on the ESXi host itself. And that's important because most operations we're going to want to conduct those through the vSphere client that we can see right here. So we'll be using vSphere client for much of what we do. But there are times when you'll need to be able to manage the server directly. And so this lockdown mode, by default, we would want to turn that on. But there'll be times when you'll want to be able to actually get on here and say do some kind of management or perform some kind of management functions directly through the direct console user interface, which we're looking at here, or directly through, oh, excuse me, I thought I had that open there. Sorry about that. Directly through the client, which we'll see a little bit later on, which is the VMware host client. Now, last couple of things here I wanted to talk about is the quick boot, which is something that allows you to perform remediation without having to reboot from rebooting the BIOS or reinitializing the BIOS. This can speed up host patching and upgrades when the BIOS doesn't need to be reinitialized. And then security features include memory hardening, which randomizes memory addresses for the kernel, the user mode application executables, which also includes your drivers and libraries. This makes it more difficult. By randomizing those memory addresses, it makes it more difficult for malicious code to use memory exploits to take advantage of vulnerabilities. ESXi also includes kernel module integrity, TPM, and UEFI secure boot, which verify the integrity of the modules, drivers, applications, and the VMware infrastructure bundles before or as they are loaded. Let's take a quick look at the lab itself. So in this lab, you will be required to log into the vSphere client to begin with. And using that login, what we're going to be doing is modifying a virtual machine that's been set up for you in advance, and you'll use this virtual machine to install an ESXi host. We'll talk a bit about that a little later, but using this virtual machine, we'll be able to actually perform host installation and configuration. You will need to access the VMvisor installer. It's an ISO. It's very small. Notice the size of that. And we'll use that to install directly onto this virtual machine that's been pre-configured for you. If you note, this ESXi, or this virtual machine that will have the ESXi host hypervisor installed, is fairly small. It has 2 CPUs and 4 gigabytes. So it's going to be a little bit slow when you're working with it. So give it time. Sometimes you may have to wait a little bit during for it to catch up. So that'll be our initial task, is to actually get that prepared. And then you'll go through the installation process. And this is a text-based process, so you'll be using function keys on your keyboard, the enter key extensively. And at times you will be required to use the keyboard and enter things like passwords, which are noted in the text. When you get to the end of that process, you'll notice we go into part 2, which is working directly with the DCUI. We can see the DCUI here. All hypervisors, all ESXi hypervisors have this direct console user interface available to it. To access it, you'll typically press the F2 function key on your keyboard. And when you do that, an authentication screen will pop up where you'll enter the password to log in. And you can see here, I've already logged in on this hypervisor here. You'll be logging in on the new ESXi hypervisor, but I wanted to show you that these are also available to take a look at, and you'll work through here. This is another text-based interface. So when you're using this, you'll be entering everything through the keyboard. You will not be able to click and move around using your mouse. So be aware of that. So make sure you pay attention to the instructions at the bottom of the page that tell you how to move about using your up and down arrow keys, using your enter key, using your escape key to go backwards. And so the instructions are pretty thorough about this, but just it may take a moment for you to get used to that. Right now I'm using my arrow key to move up and down in this window here. If I wanted to change something or look at something, let's say I wanted to look at my troubleshooting options, I can highlight that by using my arrow key to move to it, and then I can press my enter or return key, and that'll bring up the next screen that'll allow me to again move up and down and take a look at things on here. You'll be looking on here a little bit later. Make sure you follow the instructions that tells you how to change things. Once you've made your changes or you want to leave, just press your escape key as noted down here in the bottom corner to go back. And then if you want to log out, just press the escape key one more time. That'll log you out. And there you go. When you first access this DCUI, you may see it as a black screen like this. And by hitting your return key, that'll bring or activate the screen. During this portion of the lab, you will be performing several configurations. One very important one is changing the password and changing to a static IP address. So make sure you follow the instructions all the way through very thoroughly. Take your time, explore a little bit as you're going. And then in the next task, you'll enable the secure shell and the ESXi shell interfaces. And this just gives you an example of how you can set these up. Typically, by default, you would want to leave these disabled unless you really needed those. I provide a little challenge, which I'll talk about a little bit later, where you can test the secure shell. And then in your final task, you'll be adding your ESXi host to Active Directory. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is for user security, identity, and access management. And in the last task, you'll log into the ESXi host using that user account that you configured on the ESXi host. So that's pretty much it for the lab. When we come back, we'll take a look at our first task and enjoy.